That summer, I went to visit my grandmother in Little Havana in Miami. My brother was living there that summer, and I missed him, and I wanted to see my grandmother again. I thought that she would have learned English by now. It had been 10 years since she'd been in the States, and she thought that I wouldn't have forgotten Spanish. When I walked into her house, she looked exactly the way I remembered her, just a lot shorter. And she looked up at me and she said, "Oye, Papito." I just looked at her, I said, "Hi, Mimi." "Papito?" My brother said, "Tell her muy bien." "What, you don't talk Spanish no more?" I said, "Muy bien." And then she started to yell, and I understood a few words. She said, "Papito, español. Cubanos, gringo." And much to my brother's chagrin, I became in the family el gringo de la familia. One day my grandmother told me that she wouldn't have me not speaking Spanish, so she took me into the kitchen. She opened up the refrigerator. She reached in and took out a piece of flan, her favorite dessert, soft and brown and custardy, ustedes sí saben. She said, "Papito, mira, vamos a empezar. Este se llama flan." I just looked at her, I said, "Hi, Mimi." She said, "No, hi, Mimi. Flan." She walked up to me. Flan. I said, "Flan?" She said, "Very good." She reached in, she got the gallon of milk. She said, "Papito, leche." I said, "It's what?" She said, "Leche." I said, "Leche." She said, "Very good." And she reached in and she got the butter. She said, "Papito, mantequilla." Now I knew what she was trying to do. I tried to say it. "Mantequilla?" She said, "No, mantequilla." And she reached on the counter and got the ripe, red, juicy tomato. She said, "Papito, tomate." I said, "Tomate." She said, "Muy bien." She handed me that tomato. She said, "No, no, no." I said, "Sí, sí, sí." I threw it at her. Soon we had the food fight. If I could say the words correctly in Spanish, she'd give it to me and I could eat them or throw them at her. If I mispronounced it, she threw them at me. Soon the kitchen was a mess, but I was learning Spanish. Then she got out the broom and the dustpan and taught me how to sweep up in Spanish, and took me to the living room where I learned how to vacuum in Spanish and wash the windows in Spanish, and soon the whole house was clean. I got busted a couple of years ago telling this story because a woman came up to me from Puerto Rico afterwards and she said, "I knew you were exaggerating because your grandmother would never waste a good piece of flan, you know." I'm exaggerating. But little by little, that summer, my grandmother did teach me Spanish. She did tell me a story, a little joke that I wanted to share with you. She said, "Una vez había una familia de ratones." There was a family of mice that went on a picnic. They were having a great day when all of a sudden a huge cat came in and jumped at the family. Mama got so scared, but she stood on her hind paws. Her family got behind her. Her heart was going like this. She didn't know what to do. But with the courage a mother feels when her family is threatened, she stared right into the green eyes of that cat, and from someplace deep inside of her, she said, "Boo, boo, boo." The cat stopped. The cat thought maybe Mama had called all the dogs in the neighborhood, and the cat turned around, jumped over the fence, and was gone. Mama couldn't believe it worked. She got her kids home nice and safe, and she said, "You see, kids, it pays to speak another language." That was one little joke my grandmother would tell me over and over again that summer. When my brother and I would walk down the streets of Little Havana, the old Cuban men would look at my brother and they'd say, "¿De dónde tú eres en Cuba, chico? Where are you from in Cuba?" And to me, they'd look at me and they'd say, "Keep learning Spanish. You can do it, okay? Keep it up." And I would get so jealous. And then we would go to the quinceañeras, these 15 parties. Do you know what these things are? It's the Cuban girl. It's when she becomes officially a woman, and they have a huge party. And my brother knew all the dances, salsa and merengue and cumbia, and he'd be dancing the whole time with all these girls. Me, I'd be by myself in the corner, you know. And towards the end of that summer, I would sit with my grandmother on her back porch, and she had these two old wicker rocking chairs. And we sat with this big metal oscillating fan that looked like it was the only thing that made the trip from Cuba. And we'd sit in the back porch where it was hot. She didn't want to sit in the air conditioning. And we'd watch this big old TV. We'd watch the novelas, the Spanish soap operas. And every now and then a beautiful woman would come on the novela and my grandmother would say, "¿Por qué no casa con ella? Why don't you marry that one?" I'd say, "Okay, Mimi, let me call her on the phone, you know." And we would laugh. And that fan would blow on Mimi and blow on me and blow on Mimi and blow on me. And I looked at her one day towards the end of my visit and I said, "Mimi, yo no siento tan cubano como mi hermano." Y ella me dijo, pero papito, tú no eres cubano ni americano, tú eres cubano-americano. Y tienes que hablar español conmigo porque yo soy tan vieja que no puedo aprender inglés, pero tienes que hablar inglés también. She told me that I wasn't ever going to be Cuban or American. I was Cuban-American, long before it was hip to have a hyphen, before you could make money off of it, living la vida loca. And she said I had to speak Spanish because she was too old to learn English, but I had to speak English, the language of this country. And at that moment, I realized it was worse to be a gringo in my family than to be a spick in a school I didn't really care about. And I went back to high school proud to be the school's only mixed spick. So much so that I studied as much Spanish as I could, watched as much Spanish TV, listened to as many Spanish radio programs as I could. And as I moved through high school and college, I discovered what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an actor. In 1990, I moved to Chicago, where I went to Northwestern and studied acting and started to do some acting. And I found myself in the place that I find myself to this day, as the whitest person in a room full of ethnic people and the most ethnic person in a room full of whites. But I discovered storytelling. My big break came telling the only story I knew in front of 300 third graders in Logan Square, a Mexican-American community here in Chicago. I was telling the story Davy Crockett, and there was an aisle right down the middle. And as I was telling the story, Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier, I noticed that half of the kids were really paying attention, loving the story, and listening and laughing. But the kids who sat over here, they weren't paying attention at all. And I wondered, what was I doing wrong? And then I looked and saw, oh, maybe these kids only speak Spanish. So I switched the story into Spanish. And as soon as I did, all of these kids, their eyes got big. They were so thrilled hearing their language from the stage. But the kids who spoke English said, no, speak English again. So I switched back into English. But the kids over here said, no, habla español otra vez. I went back into Spanish. And by the end of the story, I was saying things like, Davy Crockett said, ven acá, tu pesky varmint, que voy a shoot you. And both groups were translating for each other. And they were laughing. And the principal came running down after the story, amazed. He said, I've never seen both groups listening at the same time. And he gave me a check for $50, more than a whole shift at the coffee house. He said, there are so many schools in Chicago and thousands of schools around this country that need someone like you. And literally overnight, I became a professional bilingual storyteller, which was a little difficult because I only knew the one story, you know. So I had to go and learn new stories. And one way I did that was by traveling to Mexico. 2 summers in a row, I went to Mexico and spent 4 or 5 weeks there and learned all kinds of stories. And now I think of myself as the guy walking along behind Kofi with that 2-sided hat, telling both sides that the hat, no, it's red on this side, it's black on this side. But that's a lonely place to be because I don't really fit on either farm. I have to travel along behind this man telling these stories for as long as I can. The one thing I learned in Mexico, well, I learned many things in Mexico, that there are pyramids in Mexico. I was not taught this when I was in high school, not too long ago. There's the 3rd largest pyramid in the world, about 10 miles outside of Mexico City. I also learned many other things about Mexico. I learned from a woman in California just about 2 months ago. She said that one person, some unthoughtful person on the street, yelled at her and said, why don't you go back to where you came from? You don't belong here. And she didn't get into it with him, but she told me, this is where I came from. This was Mexico long before it was the United States. 1848, they signed the treaty that gave Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all of California, all of Utah, and half of Colorado. That was all Mexico. Then all of a sudden, it's the United States. She said that this was her land. She was here before it was Mexico even. She said her family had been on that land for generations.